Check, check, check. Hey everybody, welcome. This is Pastor Pete from the Rock Church. Nope, that ain't gonna work. This is Rewire. Welcome everybody. My name is Peter Watts and I am the Los Angeles City Director for Rewire here in Los Angeles. And this is our first course online for Character of a Change Agent, Finding the Strength to Love. Now, you signed up for this course because you were interested in learning more and digging deeper into the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. Well, you are in the right place. Well, let's just jump right into week number 1, a tough mind and a tender heart. Our character trait this week is going to be focusing on being a critical thinker and a compassionate person. Now, this week's class, we focus on the integration of thinking critically about social issues and responding to them with compassion. Now, generally, we tend toward one or the other. However, Dr. King sees the synthesis of the two as an indispensable of one with the other instead of one over the other. And so if we are to creatively engage the world for God, we must do it as critical thinkers who have a compassionate heart. Now, in your student journal that you received, right there on pages 6 and page number 7, lays out for you the outline of section 3 for week 1. And I'm just going to read the introduction and you follow along with me in your journal. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired millions during the 1960s civil rights movement to transform the culture of race discrimination in the United States to one that affirmed the dignity of all human beings. His tireless advocacy for social justice and the nonviolent manner he used to bring about that change won him international recognition, culminating in the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Martin Luther King's life and teaching give us a model for how to creatively use the way of the cross to transform and redeem conditions of injustice and violence in our time and place. In this course, we will explore these timeless principles and values as we discover how to find the strength to put on God's transformative love into action in our world. And so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be delving into different topics there in your course outline on page 6. Week 1, a tough mind and a tender heart is what we'll deal with today. Next week, we'll look at transform nonconformist. The week after that, on being a good neighbor, love in action, loving your enemies, a knock at midnight, our God is able, the answer to a perplexing question, looking at the letter from a Birmingham jail, and then we'll close with becoming the beloved community. So this is a 10-week course, and we hope that you will stick to it each week as we bring you new content. Now, our goal is to develop a conceptual understanding of the character traits of a change agent and form a practical understanding of what that means in your life. All right? So as we enter into our class time on page number 7, I would just want to make reference to our learning objectives. 1, we want to gain an introductory understanding of the significant events in the life of Martin Luther King Jr. and the historical context of his work. 2, we want to have an understanding of the key principles of King's teachings, which define the nature and character of a person committed to creating the type of social change that's consistent with the love of God. And then thirdly, we want to understand and experience how the content of this workshop will directly impact your life. We're not here just to give you information so you can have it in your head, but we want this information to be deeply rooted in your soul, to transform your heart and move you into action in the broken places in this world. Now, there's some reading that you'll have to do in this class, some required reading. And so we want to make sure that you have the books that are necessary for this class, and it's listed right there in your student journal. On page 7 under required readings, we will post the media clips of videos and audio that you'll need to engage the content in your student journal. And then lastly, we have some recommended reading. Now, these aren't required, but you may want to just take it a step further. And so we've provided for you some recommended reading that you can decide to purchase on your own just to go deeper in your understanding of the content and in the understanding of King's life and how it will impact your life in particular. So let's jump right into it. Now, each class includes time to learn about King's life through documentary excerpts. So this helps us to root the words of King in a historical context, because a lot of times we'll hear quotes from King, we'll hear speeches, we'll even hear some audio clips, and a lot of times we don't have a proper context from which he was making those statements. And so the clips that you hear and the videos that you see will all be rooted in the context of King's life, the historical context of the time. And so in this first week, you will survey the whole of King's life using a biographical timeline. And that timeline is found in the appendix in the back of your student journal. So if you take time to look in the back of your student journal under Appendix A, you will find the biographical timeline of Dr. King's life right there in your journal. And so, as we enter into this lesson, I want to introduce to you a video clip that we're going to play. It's a video excerpt for this week to look at King's early life up to the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, the boycott was positioned King at age 25. He was a young man as a leader of this emerging civil rights movement. So let's just take some time right now and play and listen to this clip. It's about 5 minutes or more. But I want you to listen to this clip called Natural Leader. Let's tap in. Now, as you were listening to that clip in your journal, we want to guide you in this question under letter B, documentary, the early years. And we want you to take time and journal as you were engaging that clip, what stood out to you? Write that down. Now, each week, following the biographical sketch, you'll listen to an excerpt from one of King's sermons. Now, many will never have heard King's voice outside of his iconic I Have a Dream speech. Now, this gives us an opportunity to hear King's delivery, the passion and eloquence and the prophetic zeal as he spoke to people about the intimate connections between God's love and social justice. Now, this week's sermon, delivered in Detroit in 1954. It was during a time when King was the age of 25. It's in his very early years in ministry. It was the pre-Montgomery time in King's life. Now, in this, we hear hints of the powerful rhetorical style that would fully mature some years later. Now, the sermon's overriding concern is that there is a moral foundation to the universe. It's perhaps one of King's most deeply held religious commitments. The text of the excerpt begins on page 12 of your book, A Knock at Midnight, in the second paragraph. And it says, now that isn't the only thing, and then it goes on. Now, you can choose to follow along in the book. However, we prefer to invite you to close your eyes and imagine yourself in the audience listening to the message being delivered. And as you're doing that, consider this a form of meditation, allowing the words to wash over you. So I'm going to play a clip from King's early years called Rediscovering Lost Values. And following the clip, I want you to answer this question. I want to know what resonated with you or challenged you, and what words or phrases stuck out to you. So here's our time of meditation. Let's listen in. Now here's the what we call the talk part, section 4 of A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart. Now the character trait, again, that we want to emphasize for this week is being a critical thinker and a compassionate person. Now each week we will look at, again, a sermon from King's book, Strength to Love. And outside of class, you're going to read the sermon and you're going to write a reflection on it. Now, this reflection is going to be shared on our online platform and even in small groups. The sermons focus on the unique traits of a change agent, someone who's committed to putting God's love and justice into practice. So in this first sermon, A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart, King says that it is important to bring together two seemingly opposite ways of being in the world: critical thinking and compassion, or in other words, the mind and the heart. So let's start with the text that King uses as a basis for this sermon. He uses from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verses 5 through 8, and verses 16 through 20. And it says this: The 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. And then in verses 16 through verse 20, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. For it will be not you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Now, as you hear this passage and as you read this passage, what was the context for this passage? Why don't you go ahead and journal that down in your journal, in your student journal? What was the context for this passage? Now, if you put that the context of this passage was that Jesus was sending his disciples out into the world, you're correct. And disciples, what are disciples and missionaries? What are their works? What is it that they are called to do? Write that down in your journal. What are missionaries and disciples called to do? Now, if you wrote down in your journal that their main work is to announce the kingdom of healing the sick, raising the dead, driving out demons, that's revolutionary work. You see, if you're tender-hearted without a tough mind or soft-minded, you run the risk of being sentimental and passive and unfocused. And you might simply accept the status quo, unwilling to examine the truth about things for fear of what might be revealed. But King was particularly critical of blacks who he thought were complacently adjusted to segregation during that time. If you are tough-minded, without a tender heart, or cold-hearted, you run the risk of being cold and detached and bitter. You might care about an issue or a group of people in the abstract, but you were never moved enough to resolve the injustice or the need. Now, if you're neither tough-minded or neither tender-hearted, you may live out of a posture of you don't know and you don't care. You are simply ignorant of important issues and do not have the resolve to find out about them. And sometimes that can be called privilege, because you have the privilege to not know and not to engage. This is typical when people live in a bubble and do not want that bubble to be disturbed. Fourthly, a tough-minded and tender-hearted person brings the best of both together. They're not opposite polars, but they bring both of them together in what King calls a creative tension. The key is to be willing to engage reality with the mind and to have the reality that impacts your heart. And the result of that is someone who is proactive and courageously engaged in the most pressing social issues of our day. So here's a question for you. What does it take to become tough-minded? And what does it take to become tender-hearted? Take some time, pause the video, and write down what you think your response is. Well, what does it take to become tough-minded? I think of two things. One, a willingness to have one's assumptions be challenged. And we all have assumptions, and we have to be willing to have our own assumptions be challenged. The second thing is learning about the cause and the implication of social issues. So it's a willingness to have your assumptions challenged and the willingness to even learn about a cause and implications that it has for social issues. That's what it means to become tough-minded. Now, what it means to become tender-hearted is a couple. Well, when we humanize issues through hearing stories and developing relationships with people affected by that issue, that's when we learn to become tender-hearted. when we start humanizing people and humanizing the issue and hearing the stories of those people that are affected by those issues and build relationships with people, we become tender-hearted because that issue begins to affect us as well. King says this, he says this, it's this synthesis is what he's trying to reflect. It's the very nature of God. God, he says, reaches out to humanity with two arms outstretched. God is tough-minded in that he is socially critical and demands justice. Yet God is tender-hearted in that he is forgiving and loving and full of grace. This synthesis is also how King viewed his parents. He believed his father had the tough mind and his mother had the tender heart. And that formed in him that creative tension, which stimulated his interest in his deep interest in social concerns of his day, like racism and poverty, and the courage and compassion to do something about them. So as we prepare to close our time for this week, there's a reading assignment that you must engage in this week before you begin your class for next week. And before I tell you about next week's reading assignment, I want to stress to you the importance of your weekly rhythm in your journal. Now, in your journal, we have set for you a weekly rhythm. And that weekly rhythm is important. So tomorrow there's reading, followed by days of meditation and prayer and action and reflection, and then one day of rest before our next meeting. The instructions are all there in your journal. So take time to read through the very beginning parts of your journal so that you can be in the right rhythm for learning and engaging the content of this class. Now, next week, when you come prepared, you'll come prepared having done the reading and ready to share your reflections on chapter 1 of the book, Strength to Love. So your reading assignment this week is to read chapter 1, Strength to Love. And when you read, I want you to think about this reflection question that's in your platform. And the question is this: do you tend primarily to have a tough mind or a tender heart? And what might you need to do in order to create more of a synthesis between the two in your life? That's your reflection question for the week. As you read chapter 1 and get prepared for week 2 of our 10-week class for Character of a Change Agent, the Strength to Love. Once again, my name is Pastor Peter Watts, Los Angeles City Director with Rewire, and we want to thank you for joining us for this on-demand online course. We'll see you next week. Peace.